Hello and welcome to my school channel. My name is Angela, and in this video we're going to continue the government topic by topic video lesson. So we're moving on to the second part of the topic constitutional developments, the pre-independence era. So please stay with us, don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Welcome back to my school channel. So in the last segment, we talked about the Clifford's Constitution and the Richards Constitution. Now we're moving on to the Macpherson and the Lyttleton Constitution. We're going to begin with the Macpherson Constitution. So in the last class, we talked about how the Richards Constitution was designed to last for 9 years with a review every 3.5 years. But by the late 1940s, it became clear that the Richards Constitution of 1946 was inadequate. And the reason for this is it had been imposed without widespread consultation with Nigerians. Nigerians were not consulted when the Richards Constitution was written. It also had limited political reforms, which sparked increased agitation for greater African participation in governance. So Nigerians were not allowed to actively participate in the political processes at that time, which was one of the requirements after the Second World War. Remember when we were discussing the process of decolonization, we talked about how after the Second World War, there was widespread agitation for self-rule, for independence. And given that they were not giving them the opportunity to practice leadership at that time, they demanded a new constitution that allowed for more African representation. So the post-World War II era witnessed the rise of organized nationalist activities, especially from the NCNC and the AG. These were the two major political parties at that time that were advocating for self-rule. So there was mounting pressure for constitutional reforms that would reflect the aspirations of Nigerians across various regions. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, in response to this agitation, Sir John Stuart Macpherson, who succeeded Sir Otto Richards as governor of Nigeria, adopted a new approach. So rather than imposing a constitution, he initiated a broad-based consultative process. That means he decided to ask the people of Nigeria as to how the constitution should be structured. So to this end, a select committee of the Legislative Council was set up in 1949 to identify problems likely to arise from introducing a new constitution. So it's important to note that a select committee is a committee in a legislative house that is designed to investigate an issue of public importance. So this was the committee that was designed to investigate how to structure the new constitutions, that was designed to identify the problems that would arise with the introduction of the new constitution. So the Select Committee recommended the convening of a National Constitutional Conference. So this led to the historic Ibadan All-Nigerian Constitutional Conference of 1950. So we can see that they wanted Nigeria to actively participate in the creation of the constitution. That is the reason why it was Nigerians that were invited to this conference to discuss the things that should be in the constitution. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, so we're going to discuss the Ibadan All-Nigerian Constitutional Conference of 1950. So it was convened to revise the Richards Constitution, which had attracted heavy criticism. The colonial administration under Governor Sir John Macpherson recognized that any future constitution needed to be more consultative and reflective of the political aspirations of Nigerians. And so this led to a broad-based constitutional review process, beginning at village, district, and provincial levels and culminating in the All-Nigerian Constitutional Conference held in Ibadan in January 1950. So the constitution was not just held, they had to convene at different levels within the society, at the village level, at the district level, and at the provincial level before they all came together at the conference in 1950. So the conference brought together delegates from all 3 provinces. So those are the 3 provinces, the northern, the western, and the eastern provinces in the country. So in attendance were nationalist leaders, traditional rulers, and educated elites, representatives of regional legislative councils, representatives from Lagos Colony, British colonial officers including Governor John Macpherson, and observers from the British government in London. So these were all members of the conference. Notable Nigerian delegates included Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe, Chief Obafemi Awolowo, Sir Ahmadu Bello, and other emerging regional political leaders. So it's important to know that at this time, these were the important leaders in the various regions in the country. They will eventually become premiers of the various regions, as we are going to discuss under the Macpherson Constitution. Now let's move on to the next slide. What are the objectives of the conference? One of the main goals were to review the Richards Constitution and propose a more acceptable and democratic framework, a framework where Nigerians were allowed to participate in the political process, to consider a more representative system of government that would increase Nigerian participation, to determine the structure of the legislature at both the central and the regional levels, to address the issue of federalism versus unitarism, given the country's regional and ethnic diversity. So this was also a major problem that was going on in the country. Each of the regions in the country wanted to create a government that could attend to the specific needs of each of these regions. So they needed a federal structure rather than a unitary structure. So another objective was to provide a platform for Nigerian leaders from all parts of the country to discuss the political future of Nigeria. So one of the key debates was federalism versus unitarism. So delegates from the north and west supported federalism, but delegates from the east initially were in favor of unitarism. So eventually, the eastern region conceded to a federal structure in the interest of national unity. So by unitarism, we mean that a system of governments where there is only a central government and no regional governments. But federal structure is a system where there is a central government and regional governments for each of the regions within the country. So now let's move on to the next slide. All right, and that key debate was the allocation of seats in the central legislature. The North, citing its larger population, demanded and secured a majority of seats, and this led to tensions among Southern delegates. The Southerners felt like they were not adequately represented in the central legislature. Then, and that debate was election versus nomination. The conference recommended direct election for most legislative seats. So before then, under the Richards Constitution, most of the members of the legislature that were Nigerians were nominated and not directly elected by the people. So they wanted a change to that. Then, and that debate was the structure of government. The delegates supported a system of government that allowed for ministerial responsibility. So this means that each minister of the different sectors of the economy will now be responsible for their various ministries. There will be no collective responsibility anymore. Each of the different sectors of the economy will be responsible for its actions and the policies that it implements. Then executive powers were still to be retained by the colonial government for the time being. Then the recommendations of the conference includes the adoption of federalism. So Nigeria was to operate a federal system of government with 3 regions, the northern, the western, and eastern regions. So this was a change from the provincial system that was adopted by the Richards Constitution. So each region was to have its own regional legislature and executive authority. So when there is a federal structure, that means that the structures that we have at the central level is also duplicated at the regional level. That means executive and legislature will be duplicated at each of the various regions. They will have their own legislative assembly, they will have their own governors, and then they will have their own ministries. So this was what they advocated for in this conference. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, they also recommended the establishment of a bicameral legislature. So there were 2 houses as a result of their recommendations. A House of Representatives, which was the lower chamber, and which had directly elected members, and then a House of Chiefs or Senate, which was the upper chamber for the north, and advisory traditional institutions in the west and east. Then there was also the recommendation for the retention of regional councils. Regional governments were to be strengthened and given legislative authority over specified matters. Now they are able to make laws that are specific to the needs of each of these various regions. Then there was also the recommendation of the creation of a council of ministers. Ministers were to be appointed from among the elected members of the central legislature, and this allowed Nigerians to begin participating in executive governance. It's important to note that the Nigerian system was modeled after the British parliamentary system. And in a parliamentary system, you have a council of ministers elected from the legislature. These are executive officers, but they are members of the legislature nonetheless. So these people will be responsible for administering the affairs of the various sectors of the country. So there was also the recommendation of enlargement of franchise. The conference recommended the expansion of the electoral process, especially in the South, through universal adult suffrage, which was still not achieved at this point. Then Lagos remained separate. Lagos was to be separated from the western region and administered as a federal territory. So Lagos will no longer be part of the western region, but a separate federal capital territory. So it was administered separately from the west. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, what are the key features of the Macpherson Constitution? So after the Macpherson Constitution was written, we discovered that these are the various features that characterize the Macpherson Constitution. One of them is the federal structure. Nigeria was divided into 3 regions, the northern, western, and eastern, each with its own House of Assembly, and a central federal government was created with legislative and executive powers. So this is different from the Richard's Constitution. Although the Richard's Constitution advocated for regionalism at the time, they had not started dividing responsibilities among the central government and the region. So this was adopted under the Macpherson Constitution. Then we have the Council of Ministers. The governor was the president of this council. When we're talking about the Council of Ministers, we're talking about the cabinet ministers that we understand from a parliamentary system of government. So these were people elected from the legislature to conduct the day-to-day running of governments within the country. So the governor was the president of this council. The members of the council include 6 ex-officio members charged with issues relating to civil service, defense, etc. These are the various sectors within the country that you have ministers who are responsible for them. Then we have 12 Nigerian ministers, 4 representing each region and from the House of Representatives. So these unofficial ministers were not executive heads of any departments, but they were each responsible for initiating discussion of policy in the council. So another important thing to note here is the fact that the Nigerian ministers who were representing the various sectors of the economy were not in charge of actually implementing the policies. They were only allowed to initiate policies during council discussion. The people responsible for implementing those policies are still the British officials who handle day-to-day affairs within the country. Now let's move on to the next slide. Then we also have the central legislature. A central House of Representatives was created. The House consisted of 148 members, of whom the Nigerian members of the regional houses of assembly elected 136. So we can say 136 were elected by the various regions. In the northern region, they had 68 representatives. The eastern region had 34 representatives, and the western region had 34 representatives as well. So 6 members were appointed by the governor to represent those not properly represented. This means the minor ethnic groups within the country. We can begin to see that minority issues beginning to develop within the country at that time. We're going to discuss a lot of that under the Lyttleton Constitution and in preparation for the Independence Constitution. 6 members will be ex-official members, the 3 lieutenant governors, the chief secretary, the financial secretary, and the attorney general. These are all British officials who were part of the central legislature as well. Now let's move on to the next slide. Okay, we also have the Regional Executive Council. Each region was provided with an executive council with the lieutenant governors as the president. By lieutenant governors, we mean the governors of each of the regions who answer to the central governments. Then we also have 3 ex-official members, 2 official members appointed by the lieutenant governor, and 9 regional ministers. So the council advised the governor, but he could reject or accept such advice. So the Regional Executive Council is modeled after the Council of Ministers at the central level. So you can see how regionalism was beginning to develop under the Macpherson Constitution. Then there was also the governor's reserve power. All regional bills were sent by the governor of Nigeria and subject to the approval of himself and the Council of Ministers. This means that when a bill has been debated in the central legislature, it has to be assented to by the governor, and the governor can either choose to accept or reject the bill. So the governor had reserve powers to refuse to assent any bill passed by the House of Representatives and to order that any bill rejected by the House should come into effect as if it has been passed by the House. So this also shows that in spite of the fact that Nigerians have been elected into the legislature, they have no real power because the governor can still choose to accept or reject any of the bill that has been discussed in the legislative house. Just as the governor has reserve power, the lieutenant governors also have reserve power in their various regions. Remember, there is duplication of function at the various regional level. So the lieutenant governors are representing the governor at their regions, and he too can choose to accept or reject the bills that have been discussed in the regional assembly. Now let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so we also have regional houses of assembly. Each region had the power to make laws on local matters such as cooperative societies, social welfare, local government, native courts, and health. For each of the various regions, the regional houses of assembly are created differently. So for the northern region, they had a bicameral legislature, a House of Chiefs, which was the upper house, and the House of Assembly, which was the lower house. Under the House of Chiefs, you had the president of the assembly, which was the lieutenant governor. Official members, they had 3 official members and 37 chiefs who were regarded as other members of the legislature, and then they had an advisor on Islamic law. Then for the House of Assembly, the president was appointed by the lieutenant governor. Official members were 4. Then they had 90 elected members and 10 special members. So this was the composition of the regional assembly in the northern region. Then for the western region, the House of Chiefs composed of the lieutenant governor, 3 official members, 50 chiefs, and 3 special members. Then the House of Assembly consisted of a president who was appointed by the lieutenant governor, 4 official members, 80 elected members, and 3 special members. Then for the eastern region, they had a unicameral legislature. There was no House of Chiefs. Remember, most of these houses of chiefs, they were modeled to ensure that traditional rulers are allowed to participate in the decision-making process in the country. So most of the members of the House of Chiefs were actually traditional rulers, people who had traditional titles within this various region. But for the eastern region, remember when we discussed the pre-colonial administrative system, we discussed how they had no chiefs or traditional rulers. They had a decentralized system. So as a result of that, there was no need for a House of Chiefs for them. So they only had a House of Assembly. The president was the lieutenant governor. There were 5 official members, 80 elected members, and 3 special members. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, what are the achievements of the Macpherson Constitution? One of the achievements is that it was the first broad-based constitution. It was the first constitution developed with full Nigerian consultations at all levels. Remember how they consulted the village, the districts, and the provinces before they made any recommendations for the constitution. So this became the first constitution that was Nigerian in a sense, because Nigerians were consulted in the process of drafting the constitution. And that achievement was that it established federalism in Nigeria. Although Nigeria was not truly a federal state at the time the Macpherson Constitution was created, it introduced that federal structure, which later defined Nigeria's political system. Then there was also increased political participation, which allowed for wider Nigerian representation, especially in legislative and executive councils. People were allowed to be elected into these different houses. And then those elected, the various regions can get people to represent them at the Central Assembly. So this allowed for increased political participation from Nigerians. Then there was also strengthened nationalist movements, which provided a platform for political parties. So the NCNC, AG, and the MPC were the major political parties at that time. And the reason they were allowed to exist was because of the Macpherson Constitution. Then there was also the introduction of electoral college. The Constitution allowed for indirect elections of members of the House. So members of the Central Legislature were appointed through the Electoral College. The various regional assemblies were the Electoral College. They were the ones who chose those who should represent the various regions in the Central Assembly. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, so another achievement is ministerial experience. Nigerians gained experience in governance by serving as ministers, preparing them for future self-rule. So the fact that they were given more responsibility allowed them to understand how a government should run. And this was what gave them the opportunity to practice their leadership skills so that they will be able to use them when Nigeria gained independence. Then there was also autonomy of the regions. The regions were given more power to deliberate on issues of local importance relating to health, social welfare, local governments, and so on. So the regions were allowed to make laws and execute policies that are specific to the needs of each of the regions. Then there was also the motion for self-government. The motion for self-government was moved in the House of Representatives and discussed at the 1953 London Constitutional Conference, and this laid the foundation for the process of decolonization of Nigeria. So without the Macpherson Constitution, there will be no representation in the Central Assembly that would allow for the motion of self-governance to be raised. So the Macpherson Constitution allowed for that motion. Then another achievement is parliamentary democracy. The creation of the House of Representatives at the national level marked a shift towards parliamentary democracy, which was a system that would be practiced in the early years of Nigeria's independence. So when Nigeria gained the independence, Nigeria was still practicing a parliamentary system of government. Nigeria still practiced that until 1966, But the reason why they were able to do that was because the Macpherson Constitution gave them the opportunity to learn how the parliamentary democracy should work in the Nigerian society. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, so what are the weaknesses of the Macpherson Constitution? One of them is ethnic divisions. So regionalism increased ethnic and sectional divisions, particularly through party politics. Remember, the political parties that were developed were created along ethnic lines. The MPC was for the northern region, the AG was for the western region, and the NCNC was for the eastern region. So this created ethnic division within the country, and this continues to haunt Nigeria to this day. Then there was indirect elections. Elections were still mostly indirect, which limited true popular representations. So people who were elected into the central representation was through the electoral college, the regional assemblies in each of these regions. They were not able to elect these members of the central assembly directly. So indirect election was a weakness of the Macpherson Constitution. The fallout in 1953 was also another weakness. The constitutional framework failed to resolve tensions, leading to a crisis in the House of Representatives in 1953 and the eventual collapse of the Macpherson Constitution. So that motion for self-government in 1953 led to a lot of fallout. There was the constitutional crisis, there was the Kano riots of 1953, all as a result of the introduction of that motion for self-governance. We're going to discuss this a lot more in the following slides. Then there was also veto power. The Constitution still gave reserved powers to the governor, who has the power to veto bills made by both the central and regional assemblies. So he also has the power to accept or reject policy directions from his council of ministers. So again, we can still see that the governor is essentially authoritarian in that sense because he has most of the power. He can choose to accept or reject the bill that have actually been discussed by Nigerians within the House of Assembly. So this is a huge weakness for the Macpherson Constitution. Now let's move on to the next slide. Okay, another weakness is that there was no provision for the office of the Prime Minister. So there was no provision made for the office of the Prime Minister, even though a Westminster-style system was adopted. Instead, the governor held a more powerful role than the traditional Prime Minister. So at the time the Macpherson Constitution was created, there was no Prime Minister. There was meant to be a Prime Minister in the central legislature since it was a Westminster-style parliamentary system of government. But there was no Prime Minister at that time. And the person who took on the role of the Prime Minister was the governor, who had a lot more power than the traditional Prime Minister. Then there was also dual membership in the legislature. Lieutenant governors in the region were both members of the regional legislature and House of Assemblies. So members elected to be part of the House were also members of the regional houses. This can be a huge disadvantage because the lieutenant governors now have more power than they should because they belong to both the regional legislature and the central legislature at the same time. Then there is also regional crisis. After the 1951 regional elections, Azikiwe was elected to the Western Regional Assembly but was blocked by the AG from being nominated to the Federal House of Representatives. So this prompted him to move to the Eastern region to join the Eastern House of Assembly. These ethnic divisions stemmed from the Macpherson Constitution. Again, the Macpherson Constitution allowed for that division along ethnic lines so that people who are from another region, who were born in another region, cannot contest for elections in a different region. So Azikiwe contested for election there. Though he was able to gain admission into the House in the West, he was not allowed to be nominated for representation of the West in the Central Assembly. So we can see that the Macpherson Constitution led to a lot of ethnic divisions within the country at that time. So we'll come to the end of this segment of the video lesson. If you'd like to continue on this journey with us, please go down to the link in the description below. This takes you to my school website where you can subscribe for the government topic by topic video lesson. There we are going to discuss the constitutional crisis of 1953, how the motion for self-government led to the Kano riots of 1953 and the constitutional conferences that eventually took place after then and which led to the creation of the Lyttleton Constitution. We're also going to discuss the process of the creation of the Lyttleton Constitution and what happened after then. So I hope to see you there. I believe you enjoyed this content. Please do not forget to hit the like button, click on the subscribe button, and lastly tap on the notification bell to get informed as soon as we release the next videos.